The janitor's hand moved with precision, almost like an artist tracing lines on a blank canvas. He lifted the marker and began to write a single equation on the whiteboard. But this was no ordinary problem, the kind professors usually scribble and then solve in 5 minutes. No, this equation was intricate, layered with complex symbols, fractions, and variables that twisted across the board like a mathematical labyrinth. Students who had been leaning back in their chairs, smirking moments ago, now leaned forward, their eyes widening. They squinted, trying to make sense of the symbols, to recognize familiar formulas, but the further they looked, the more impossible it seemed. Half the class, even the top math students, had to blink twice, hoping their eyes were playing tricks on them. They weren't. Every symbol, every mark, every variable was correct. It was a puzzle designed for someone far beyond their comprehension. One student whispered to his neighbor, voice trembling slightly, Is that calculus?" Another shook his head, eyes glued to the board. "No, that's not anything I've seen before. Maybe advanced calculus, or some kind of theoretical math. I can't even begin to understand it." The janitor, who moments ago had seemed like nothing more than a simple staff member, now looked every bit the part of a master. He stood upright, his posture calm, unassuming, yet exuding authority. He paused, marker in hand, and scanned the room with those same piercing eyes he had used when first entering. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation, the students almost holding their breath in fear and curiosity combined. Then, without warning, he turned slowly to face the class. The motion was deliberate, controlled, commanding, but not aggressive. His gaze met theirs, and his calm voice filled the room. "Anyone here know how to solve this?" The words barely seemed loud, yet they carried an undeniable weight. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Immediately the room froze. Phones were forgotten. Notebooks were abandoned. The usual chatter had vanished completely. Every student's heartbeat seemed to echo audibly in the sudden silence. Even the so-called top students, the ones who prided themselves on their intelligence and competitive edge, felt a wave of uncertainty wash over them. They shook their heads slightly, unable to even lift a hand in response. One boy whispered, almost to himself, why would a janitor ask that? Another muttered under his breath, "He's testing us, or mocking us. I don't know which." And yet, the janitor simply smiled. A small, knowing smile. One that didn't carry arrogance or malice, but something far more unsettling to the students: certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing not only the answer, but the outcome. He knew they couldn't solve it, and yet he didn't express disappointment or scorn. There was calmness in his smile, a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate outward, commanding attention without a word. For a moment, some students tried to look confident, to regain a sense of superiority. One of the top performers leaned back in his chair, tapping his pencil against his desk nervously, attempting to seem unfazed. But his eyes betrayed him. He knew, deep down, he knew that this problem was beyond him. The equation itself was a masterpiece of complexity. Variables nested within variables, exponential terms intertwined with fractions, obscure symbols that hinted at advanced theories. Even students who prided themselves on being quick thinkers were unable to make sense of it. They tilted their heads, squinted, and whispered to each other, trying to find some clue, some tiny opening that would allow them to solve it. But there was none. The janitor didn't speak again. He simply waited. His presence alone was enough to demand silence and focus. It was as if the very air around him had thickened with the weight of intelligence and experience, suffocating the arrogance that had filled the room just moments before. Every student, even those who had mocked him earlier, now felt a deep, almost instinctive respect. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in slightly, concentrating the attention on the board, on the janitor, and on the impossible challenge that now loomed over them. Students felt an unusual pressure, an unspoken understanding that this was not a mere exercise in mathematics. This was a test of perception, of humility, and of awareness. Some tried to whisper solutions to each other, pointing at variables, muttering formulas, but the equations were too intricate. Each attempt to make sense of it only highlighted how little they understood. The janitor's smile remained, a quiet reminder that he already knew the limits of their knowledge. He didn't need to say a word. His expression alone conveyed authority, experience, and wisdom accumulated over years they couldn't even imagine. For a few moments, time seemed suspended. Students stared at the board as if willing the answer to appear through sheer force of concentration. The ones who had been bold and brash earlier now slouched in their seats, realizing that their mockery had been misplaced, that their assumptions had been wrong. Then, slowly, the janitor placed the marker down on the ledge of the whiteboard. He didn't rush. He didn't flaunt. He simply stepped back, letting the equation speak for itself. The silence in the room was almost tangible, a living entity, wrapping around every student and stretching the moment to feel like eternity. And still he smiled. That same knowing smile. It wasn't a smug smile, not really. It was the smile of someone who understood truth, knowledge, and patience. The kind of smile that quietly says, "I know more than you realize, and that's okay." Every student in that classroom, even the ones who had mocked him before, felt it, the weight of the impossible. The awareness that they had underestimated someone who, by all appearances, seemed ordinary. The lesson had already begun, even before a single solution had been written, before a single answer had been revealed. In that silence, the janitor had already taught them something invaluable. Appearances can be deceiving. Intelligence isn't always visible. And sometimes the person who seems the least significant may hold more knowledge, wisdom, and skill than the loudest, most confident people in the room. The students sat frozen, captivated and humbled. The janitor's eyes scanned the room one last time, resting briefly on each face. He didn't mock, didn't scold. He simply acknowledged the tension, the surprise, the dawning realization in each mind that they were about to witness something extraordinary. And in that quiet, suspenseful moment, the class waited, knowing instinctively that whatever came next would not only solve the impossible equation, but also change their understanding of what it meant to judge, to assume, and to truly see. The impossible question had been asked. The room was silent. The lesson had begun. The room had barely settled after the strange entrance of the janitor when the whispers started. At first they were quiet, almost innocent murmurs, the kind you don't notice unless you're listening closely. But slowly they grew louder, turning into laughter, soft giggles at first, then harder snickers that bounced off the classroom walls. A few of the students were bold enough to speak aloud. One of the boys sitting near the back leaned over to his friend, smirking as he whispered, "Bro, wrong room. Custodians meet downstairs." His voice carried just enough to draw the attention of a few others, and the laughter spread like wildfire. Another student, leaning against a desk with an air of arrogance, added, "Yeah, this class is for smart people, not cleaners." His smirk widened as he glanced around, waiting for approval. Some of the more confident students snickered quietly. A few even nudged each other, whispering comments meant to be funny but laced with disrespect. The janitor didn't flinch. Not once. No furrowed brow, no twitch of irritation, not even a flicker of embarrassment. He remained calm, almost serene, like the room's energy of mockery didn't exist. He didn't raise his voice, didn't sigh, didn't mutter a single word. He simply observed, silently scanning each student, his dark eyes calm but piercing, as though quietly noting who had judged him and who had not. The students who had mocked him initially felt a rush of bravado. Some leaned back in their chairs, crossing their arms as if daring him to respond. They expected a reaction, a snap, a scolding, anything. But the silence from the janitor only made them more uneasy. There was a subtle power in his composure, an invisible weight that seemed to pull all attention toward him without a word. Without warning, he moved. Not abruptly, but with a quiet authority that demanded the room notice him. He stepped toward the board, his mop and bucket now resting harmlessly to the side, and reached for the marker. The sound of the cap clicking open seemed unnaturally loud, slicing through the murmurs like a knife. For a brief moment, the classroom, once alive with chatter, laughter, and phone notifications, fell completely silent. Not a single student breathed audibly. Even those who had been joking just seconds ago froze, unsure of what to expect. Some students leaned forward slightly in their seats, instinctively sensing that this was no ordinary moment, that whatever was about to happen might be significant in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The janitor raised the marker in his hand, holding it lightly, almost reverently. It wasn't a gesture of threat, nor one of confrontation. It was simple, deliberate, and quiet, but in that quietness lay an almost imperceptible aura of command. His calm demeanor seemed to contrast violently with the chaos that had dominated the room just minutes before. Students exchanged nervous glances. Whispers started again, soft but frantic. What is he doing? Why is he touching the board? Is he crazy? A girl in the front row pressed her notebook against her chest, trying to hide the shiver running down her spine. Does he know what he's doing? She whispered to her neighbor, her voice trembling slightly. The boy beside her shrugged, but didn't look away. Even he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Some students tried to laugh it off, but their laughter was weak and forced. The energy in the room had shifted. What had been disrespect and mockery moments ago had been replaced by curiosity, uncertainty, and a strange sense of anticipation. Every pair of eyes followed the janitor as he slowly placed the marker against the board. Then, almost imperceptibly, he began to write. His hand moved with surprising precision. Every stroke of the marker seemed deliberate, confident, and controlled. The students craned their necks, trying to see what was being written. A few gasped quietly, realizing that the symbols and equations forming on the board weren't simple doodles. They were complex, intricate, and beyond the understanding of most in the room. Even the most confident students felt a twinge of doubt. Their smirks faded. The ones who had mocked him moments ago now looked at him with curiosity tinged with fear. Who was this man really? How could someone who appeared to be nothing more than a janitor display such skill and command over knowledge that most of them struggled to comprehend? The room held its collective breath. Phones were discreetly put down. Laptops were closed. Even the students who had been texting, scrolling, or whispering moments before found themselves unable to look away. The janitor's calm composure, combined with the unexpected display of intelligence, created a tension that was palpable, so thick it seemed to hang in the air like a fog. Still, he did not speak. Not yet. He wrote carefully, slowly, almost meditatively, like every stroke was part of a larger ritual. Students felt the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The laughter, the jokes, the whispered insults, they were all gone. In their place was a deep, uneasy silence and a shared realization they had underestimated him. The janitor finally stepped back slightly from the board, marker in hand, and allowed the room to absorb what had just been written. The silence lingered, a few seconds stretching like minutes. Students shifted nervously in their seats, unsure whether to speak, move, or even breathe. The air was charged, electric, as if something monumental had already happened, though nothing had yet been said. And in that quiet tension, one thing was certain. The rules of the classroom had changed. The students who had mocked, whispered, and laughed now realized that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Not in the way they had expected, and certainly not in the way they had judged, but extraordinary nonetheless. For the first time that day, the students felt respect. Not forced, not demanded, but earned through silent confidence, composure, and the unmistakable aura of someone who knew more than anyone had given him credit for. The janitor didn't react to the disrespect. He didn't even acknowledge it directly. And yet, through calm, measured action, he had already begun to command the room in a way words never could. He had transformed mockery into attention, laughter into silence, and disrespect into a powerful, unspoken lesson that the students would not forget for the rest of their lives. Everyone laughed at him when he walked in, but 10 minutes later, every single person in that room was speechless. The first day of a new semester always carried its own kind of chaos. Students stormed into the lecture hall like a wave, laughing loudly, comparing schedules, scrolling endlessly through their phones, and tossing backpacks onto desks without a second thought. The room buzzed with that familiar combination of excitement and carelessness, the kind that only comes when no one knows what's waiting for them yet. Some were half asleep, hugging their coffee cups like life support. Others were already forming small cliques, talking about weekend parties, complaining about 8 a.m. classes, or bragging about how they barely studied last year and still passed. It was noise layered with more noise, packed into 4 walls that barely held together the restless energy of 100 young minds. But then, the door opened. Quietly, almost too quietly, a man stepped in. Not a professor with a briefcase. Not a student with headphones. Just a man. Older, slower, and simple in appearance. He wore a faded blue janitor's uniform, one sleeve slightly wrinkled, shoes scuffed at the toes, and a small ID card clipped to his chest that read facility staff. In one hand he carried a mop. In the other, a metal bucket that sloshed softly with each step he took. At first, nobody paid attention. Why would they? Janitors came and went all the time. But something about him was different. He didn't move like someone cleaning up after others. He didn't glance around for spills or trash. He wasn't searching for dust or mess. Instead, he walked straight to the front of the classroom. The noise didn't stop immediately. It slowly faded like a wave pulling back from shore when students realized he wasn't passing by, he was staying. A few raised their eyebrows. Some whispered. Others snickered under their breath. A guy in the back leaned toward his friend and muttered, "Bro, is this dude lost?" "Wrong room." Someone else laughed quietly. "Maybe he thinks he's teaching today." The janitor didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't look offended or amused. He simply stood near the large whiteboard at the front of the room, still holding the mop and bucket, like he had every right to be there. Like he was waiting, studying, observing. His eyes moved across the room slowly, carefully. Not in the way staff usually check for trash or disorder. No, his gaze was sharp, focused, intentional. Every student he looked at felt, for a second, like he could see right through them. A girl near the first row felt a strange chill and whispered, "Why is he staring like that?" Her friend shrugged. "Maybe he's waiting for the professor." But something was off. Something subtle, something hard to explain. Because his posture didn't match the uniform he wore. He didn't slouch or shuffle like someone exhausted from cleaning floors. He stood upright, calm, almost commanding, as if he belonged at the front of that room more than anyone else. Still, the mocking continued quietly. A boy wearing expensive headphones smirked. "Yo, if he starts teaching calculus, I'm dropping this class." A group of students near the window giggled behind their hands. One whispered loud enough for others to hear, "This semester's already weird." But the janitor didn't seem to notice the whispers. Or maybe he did, but simply didn't care. He placed the mop against the wall gently, set the bucket down with a soft thud, wiped his hands on his uniform, and continued scanning the classroom with that same thoughtful, almost analytical look. Some students felt their laughter die in their throats. There was something powerful, almost unsettling, about how calm he remained while surrounded by judgment, while dozens of young eyes inspected him like he didn't belong. A few students shifted uncomfortably. One closed her notebook slowly, sensing a strange tension building in the room. Another turned down his music, unsure why he suddenly felt the need to listen. The janitor took one small step closer to the board. The room grew quieter. Not all at once, but gradually, as if everyone instinctively sensed that this moment, this ordinary, strange moment, wasn't ordinary at all. Someone whispered, "Why is he still here?" Another replied, "I don't know, but something feels weird." Even the air seemed to change. A subtle stillness settled in, replacing the noisy chaos from minutes earlier. The janitor reached into his pocket. Students leaned a little closer without realizing it. It was like watching the opening scene of a movie, and everyone suddenly felt they shouldn't look away. He pulled out something small, something completely unexpected. A marker, a dry erase marker. Students stared, some confused, some amused, some suddenly nervous. Why did a janitor have a marker? Why was he standing at the board? Why did he look like he knew something none of them did? He uncapped it slowly. A girl whispered under her breath, Is he about to write something?" Her friend replied, "No way. What is happening right now?" But deep inside the silence growing in that room, every student felt it. This was not just some janitor. This was not just some random mistake. Something bigger was happening. Something none of them were ready for. And as the marker touched the board for the first time, even the loudest students held their breath, because they sensed that whatever this man was about to do was going to change the entire room, possibly the entire semester, possibly more. The janitor didn't hesitate. His hand moved with precision, confidence radiating from every motion. In under a minute, the impossible equation that had baffled the entire class was solved. Not just solved, he completed it faster, cleaner, and with a clarity that no professor in the university could have matched. Every step was meticulous, elegant, and correct. Fractions reduced flawlessly. Exponents simplified with perfect timing. Each variable fell into place as though guided by instinct rather than thought. The students couldn't believe what they were seeing. Eyes widened, mouths hung open. Even the top math students, who had thought themselves untouchable in intellect, sat frozen, staring in disbelief. Fingers that had been ready to write, to calculate, to compete, paused. The quiet scratching of pencils ceased. The murmurs that had filled the room earlier were gone, replaced by an almost reverential silence. Some students slumped in their seats, realizing their assumptions had been completely wrong. The man they had dismissed as a janitor, the one they had laughed at, mocked, and disrespected, had just performed what could only be described as genius-level mathematics in a way that no one in the room could even hope to replicate. The air felt heavier, charged with tension, awe, and a growing sense of humility that no lesson plan could ever teach. And then the door opened. It wasn't subtle. The click of the door cutting through the silence felt deafening. Every student's head turned instinctively toward the entrance. The room collectively held its breath. There, in the doorway, stood the real professor, the one everyone expected to teach, the one they had imagined would lecture them on the first day. But this professor froze, mid-step, as his eyes fell upon the board. His expression shifted from casual expectation to utter shock. Eyebrows raised, mouth slightly agape. The professor's eyes scanned the perfectly solved equation, his gaze then moving toward the man standing confidently at the front of the room. For a heartbeat, the classroom hung in suspended disbelief, all eyes darting between the janitor and the professor. Finally, the professor spoke. His voice was calm but laced with awe, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Class, meet Dr. Ellis," he said. The words echoed around the room, carrying with them a weight that none of the students could ignore. A ripple passed through the students. Whispers began. Some gasped audibly. Others covered their mouths in shock. The ones who had mocked the janitor barely moments ago looked like deer caught in headlights. They had expected to continue their day with jokes, laughter, and casual disregard, but instead they were facing a reality that flipped their assumptions entirely. The professor continued, his voice firm now, authoritative. "He's not our janitor. He's the new head of the mathematics department and one of the smartest minds in the country." The words hit the students like a lightning bolt. Their eyes darted around, seeking confirmation, disbelief etched into every face. The girl in the front row leaned back in her chair, her hand frozen over her notebook, whispering to no one in particular, "Wait, what?" A boy in the back of the room muttered under his breath, almost as if speaking it aloud would make it real. That can't be real. "He's the janitor," his words faltered, swallowed by his own shock. The room was a blend of chaos and stunned silence. Those who had been bold enough to laugh, whisper, and make fun moments ago now felt the weight of humiliation. Slowly, their postures shifted. Shoulders slumped. Heads hung low. Each student sank into their seat, trying to disappear into the floor, their bravado evaporating like mist. The confidence they had clung to moments earlier had crumbled in an instant. Even the professor, still standing at the doorway, could barely hide his astonishment. He took a step closer, gesturing subtly to the man at the board. "Dr. Ellis will be teaching this class," he said, his voice now steady, authoritative. "Pay attention. You are about to learn from one of the greatest minds alive today." The janitor, now revealed as Dr. Ellis, smiled. It wasn't a smug smile, not a victorious one. It was calm, collected, and almost kind. It carried the quiet authority of someone who had long been underestimated, but had chosen the perfect moment to reveal his true skill. There was no gloating, only the undeniable presence of brilliance. The students stared. Their minds raced. Questions tumbled over themselves. How could they have been so blind? How could someone who seemed so ordinary, so invisible, perform something so extraordinary? And most painfully, why had they assumed he was nothing more than a janitor? Every student who had mocked him moments earlier now felt a piercing sense of regret. The laughter, the jokes, the casual disrespect, they had all been premature, naive, and, in that moment, painfully obvious. Some closed their eyes, wishing they could erase the memory of their own assumptions. Others just sat frozen, their thoughts too scattered to even speak. The air in the room shifted. Awe replaced mockery. Curiosity replaced judgment. And in that silence, the lesson was unmistakable. Intelligence, skill, and potential cannot be measured by appearances alone. Dr. Ellis finally placed the marker down on a ledge. his posture relaxed but commanding. He looked around the room, his gaze meeting each student's eyes for a brief, silent moment. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, a silent reminder that brilliance often arrives quietly, without fanfare, and is revealed only when the moment is right. The students, humbled and astonished, began to realize that their first impressions had been completely wrong. The man they had mocked, disrespected, and underestimated was now the person from whom they would learn, grow, and be challenged for the rest of the semester. And perhaps more importantly, they understood a truth that no equation could ever teach them: never judge anyone by appearances. Some students whispered quietly to each other, still trying to process the shock. Did he really just solve that? "I can't believe we laughed at him," another admitted, voice tinged with guilt. And somewhere in the back, a student muttered, "I hope I can learn even half of what he knows." The room had transformed in under a minute. What had started as mockery had ended as revelation. What had begun with disrespect had culminated in awe, respect, and a deep, humbling lesson. Dr. Ellis turned back to the board, ready to teach. And as the first words left his lips, the class sat, silent and attentive, fully aware that they were in the presence of a mind that few would ever forget. The reveal had stunned the room. But the lesson, the real lesson, was only just beginning. The classroom was still buzzing with the aftermath of revelation, though the buzz was no longer laughter or whispers. It was the quiet, almost reverent tension of minds grappling with something far bigger than a single equation. Dr. Ellis, the man who had entered moments ago as a janitor and had now revealed himself as one of the greatest mathematical minds alive, finally set the marker down on a ledge of the whiteboard. The sound of it clicking against the metal seemed louder than any voice, resonating through the room like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that no one had expected. He turned slowly, eyes sweeping across the faces of every student. Some looked at him with awe, others with guilt, a few still in disbelief. The room had been transformed from a place of chatter, jokes, and casual disrespect into a space of silence, focus, and introspection. Every eye was on him, every mind straining to comprehend not just what had happened, but what it meant. And then he spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, not to create tension, just softly, simply, and with a weight that made the entire room lean in, as if even a single word carried significance. "Your intelligence," he said, his voice calm yet firm, "is measured by your respect, not by your ego." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Silence followed, not the uncomfortable kind, not the pause before someone speaks, but the kind of silence that demands attention, reflection, and understanding. Phones, which moments ago had been casually scrolling screens of social media and memes, were now still. Whispers, which had filled the room with careless chatter, had vanished completely. Every student, regardless of their previous demeanor, was listening. Truly listening. Some leaned forward in their seats, elbows on the desk, resting their chins on their hands, trying to absorb the simple yet profound truth in his statement. Others tilted their heads, trying to reconcile their own actions and assumptions with the wisdom they had just witnessed. Even the students who had mocked him, the ones whose laughter had filled the room just minutes earlier, found themselves shrinking in their seats, feeling the weight of their misjudgment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every syllable he spoke carried authority because it came from someone who had already demonstrated knowledge, skill, and experience far beyond what anyone else in that room could imagine. The lesson wasn't about mathematics or equations or even intelligence in the conventional sense. The lesson was about perception, humility, and the quiet power of character. Dr. Ellis paused, letting the silence settle around the room, letting it sink in. The students began to realize that the greatest minds, the people whose impact lasts, whose achievements inspire others, don't always announce themselves. They don't always demand recognition. Often, they arrive quietly, work in silence, and choose the perfect moment to reveal their capability. And when they do, the effect is profound. A student in the back row whispered to his neighbor, almost incredulously, "We laughed at him, we thought he was just some janitor." The neighbor nodded slowly, eyes wide, voice trembling. I can't believe we were wrong. Completely wrong." Dr. Ellis caught that exchange with a faint, knowing smile. It wasn't smug. It wasn't condescending. It was calm, quiet validation, a recognition that the students were beginning to understand something important, something that would stay with them long after the lecture ended. He began walking slowly to the front of the room, hands behind his back, eyes still scanning each face. Every movement was deliberate, calm, and composed. His presence alone seemed to command attention, as if the very air around him had shifted, carrying the weight of wisdom accumulated over decades. The students felt it instinctively. Respect wasn't something demanded, it was earned, and they were now learning that lesson firsthand. Your assumptions, Dr. Ellis continued softly, don't define the truth. What you see isn't always what exists. The quietest, humblest, or least conspicuous person in a room may hold knowledge, insight, and ability that surpasses anyone else here. And recognizing that requires humility, not ego. The words settled deep into the minds of the students. Some of them felt a pang of shame for their previous behavior. Some felt awe at the unexpected brilliance they had witnessed. And some felt a spark of inspiration, a realization that intelligence and respect were not about appearances, social status, or arrogance, but about substance, patience, and the willingness to let actions speak louder than words. He stopped at the center of the room, gazed steady, and looked out over the sea of young faces. Remember this moment, he said quietly, because it will stay with you longer than any equation you ever solve. The world is full of people who may appear ordinary, insignificant, or even invisible. And the greatest among them often choose to work silently, unnoticed, until the moment is right. And when that moment comes, their impact is undeniable. A hush fell over the room. Students who had been restless, distracted, or dismissive moments ago now felt the weight of truth pressing down on them. The lesson was no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, and personal. Even the most arrogant students, those who had smirked or whispered cruel comments at his expense, now sat with heads bowed slightly, unable to hide their humility. They had learned in a single lesson more about respect, judgment, and human potential than any textbook could teach them in a semester. Dr. Ellis stepped back, hands still clasped behind him. Do not measure greatness by noise, ego, or outward appearance. Measure it by character, knowledge, patience, and respect for others. That is the true mark of intelligence. The students absorbed every word. The room remained still, no chatter, no movement, just quiet reverence. Phones were down, pencils idle, eyes fixed on the man who had been underestimated only moments ago. He had transformed not only the board but their understanding, not only the class but their perception of the world. And then, with one final quiet nod, Dr. Ellis smiled, a smile that held the promise of knowledge, patience, and wisdom. Every student felt it in their chest, a spark of realization that this lesson would stay with them forever. The greatest people, they now understood, often arrive silently. They are recognized only when they choose to speak. And when they do, the world notices. Not because they demand attention, but because they have earned it through their actions, their skill, and their quiet strength. The room remained silent for a moment longer. Then, slowly, the students began to sit taller. Not in arrogance, but in newfound awareness. They had witnessed brilliance. They had witnessed humility. And most importantly, they had witnessed a lesson that would never be forgotten. Because the truth had hit them hard. Respect, humility, and the quiet power of knowledge are worth more than ego, appearances, or mockery. And the memory of this moment, the janitor who turned out to be Dr. Ellis, would echo in their minds for years to come. Wow, can you believe what just happened? If you love this story, make sure to smash that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that will blow your mind. Comment below, what would you do if you were in that classroom? Let us know. We read every comment. And remember, the quietest people often have the biggest surprises. Stay curious and see you in the next video.